Long before cities glowed through the night, darkness was the default state of human civilization. After sunset, activity slowed. Candles and oil lamps provided limited light, but they could not transform entire environments. Industry paused, communication halted. The rhythm of life followed the natural cycle of day and night. Long before cities glowed through the night, darkness was the default state of human civilization. Modern infrastructure is designed to be invisible. A global blackout has never occurred. Not in the fully interconnected modern sense. But fragments of it have. Moments where entire regions lost power. Where systems failed unexpectedly. Where the illusion of stability fractured, if only briefly. These events were contained. Temporary. Eventually resolved. But they reveal something critical. How modern systems behave under stress. And more importantly, how quickly control can be lost. New York, 1977, darkness and disorder. On a humid July night in 1977, lightning struck a substation north of New York City. At first it seemed like a routine disruption. But within minutes, the situation escalated. Transmission lines failed. Protective systems triggered. Power plants disconnected. The grid began to fragment. Within hours, New York City was in complete darkness. Unlike previous outages, this blackout occurred during a period of economic strain and social tension. The result was immediate. Looting spread across multiple neighborhoods. Fires were set. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Over 1,000 fires were reported in a single night. Thousands of arrests followed. The blackout lasted less than 24 hours. But the societal impact was intense. It revealed a pattern. When systems fail suddenly, behavior changes rapidly. Not everywhere, but enough to alter the environment. Northeast Blackout 2003, a system overwhelmed. On August 14, 2003, a high-voltage power line in Ohio came into contact with overgrown trees. A minor event. One that should have been contained. But it was. A software failure prevented operators from seeing the problem. As the line shut down, its load shifted to other lines. Those lines overloaded and failed. The cascade began. Within minutes, power was lost across large parts of the northeastern United States and Canada. More than 50 million people were affected. Cities including New York, Detroit, Cleveland, and Toronto went dark. Subways stopped. Airports halted operations. Water systems lost pressure. The blackout lasted up to 2 days in some areas. The cause was not a single catastrophic failure. It was a combination of small issues. Tree maintenance. Software malfunction. Delayed response. Together, they created a systemic collapse. India 2012, the largest blackout in history. In July 2012, India experienced the largest blackout ever recorded. More than 600 million people, nearly 10% of the world's population, lost power. The failure began with overloading. Regions were drawing more power than allocated. Transmission lines became stressed. When one failed, the load shifted. Other lines failed in response. The cascade spread across multiple grids. Entire regions went dark. Railways stopped. Hospitals switched to emergency power. Water systems were disrupted. Recovery took time. But the scale of the event revealed something significant. Even large, complex grids can collapse under sustained imbalance. Italy 2003, a cross-border failure. In September 2003, a power line between Switzerland and Italy failed. Again, a seemingly minor event. But Italy relied heavily on imported electricity. When the line disconnected, the sudden loss of supply created instability. The grid could not compensate. Within seconds, the entire country went dark. Nearly 60 million people were affected. The failure crossed borders. A problem in one region triggered a collapse in another. This is the nature of interconnected systems. They share strength, but they also share risk. Venezuela 2019, prolonged collapse. In March 2019, Venezuela experienced a massive blackout. Unlike previous events, this was not resolved quickly. Power outages persisted for days. In some areas for weeks. Water systems failed. Food distribution was disrupted. Healthcare systems struggled to operate. The causes were complex. Aging infrastructure. Maintenance issues. Operational challenges. Regardless of the exact trigger, the result was clear. When power is not restored quickly, the effects compound. Short-term disruption becomes long-term crisis. Texas 2021 when systems freeze. In February 2021, an extreme winter storm struck Texas. Temperatures dropped far below normal levels. Energy demand surged as heating systems operated at full capacity. At the same time, energy production declined. Natural gas supplies were disrupted. Wind turbines froze. Power plants struggled to operate in the cold. The grid faced a severe imbalance. To prevent total collapse, operators implemented controlled outages. Millions of people lost power. Some for days. Water systems froze. Pipes burst. Access to basic resources became limited. The event highlighted a different vulnerability. Systems designed for specific conditions may fail under unexpected extremes. Ukraine 2015, the first cyber blackout. In December 2015, a coordinated cyber attack targeted Ukraine's power grid. Attackers gained access to control systems. They remotely shut down substations. Power was lost across multiple regions. Operators were forced to switch to manual control. Restoration took hours. The scale was limited. But the implications were not. It demonstrated that infrastructure could be disrupted remotely. Without physical damage. Without traditional force. A new form of vulnerability had emerged. Patterns across failures. These events differ in scale, cause, and context. But they share common patterns. Failures often begin with small disturbances. A single line. A minor error. A localized imbalance. Systems respond. But under certain conditions, the response is insufficient. The failure spreads. Cascading across networks. Escalating rapidly. Another pattern emerges in recovery. Short outages are manageable. Longer outages become exponentially more difficult. Not just technically, but socially. Infrastructure can be repaired. But societal stability depends on time. Time is the critical factor. In every blackout, time determines the outcome. Minutes create inconvenience. Hours create disruption. Days create crisis. Beyond that, the effects become systemic. Supply chains break down. Resources become scarce. Coordination becomes difficult. In regional blackouts, external support is available. Other regions remain functional. Resources can be redirected. But in a global scenario, there is no unaffected region. No external support. Every system is under pressure simultaneously. The illusion of scale. It is easy to assume that larger systems are more resilient. That scale provides strength. But scale also introduces complexity. More components. More dependencies. More pathways for failure. Large systems can absorb small disturbances. But when failures exceed a certain threshold, scale becomes a disadvantage. Because coordination becomes more difficult. And recovery becomes slower. Human behavior under stress. Blackouts do not just affect infrastructure. They affect behavior. In some cases, communities cooperate. Resources are shared. Order is maintained. In others, stress leads to conflict. Competition for resources. Breakdown of normal routines. The outcome depends on multiple factors. Duration. Preparation. Social conditions. But one pattern is consistent. Uncertainty increases tension. And prolonged uncertainty changes behavior. What these events do not show. Each of these blackouts was limited. Geographically. Temporally. Eventually power was restored. Systems recovered. But they do not fully represent a global scenario. Because they occurred in a world where other systems remained functional. Communication networks in unaffected regions. Supply chains operating elsewhere. International support available. A global blackout removes these safety nets. It creates a condition where all regions face disruption simultaneously. A glimpse of the larger picture. These case studies are fragments. Partial views of a much larger possibility. They show how systems fail. How failures spread. How recovery becomes more difficult over time. They reveal the mechanics, but not the full scale. A global blackout would combine these elements: the speed of cascading failure, the scale of large outages, the duration of prolonged disruptions, and the complexity of interconnected systems. The critical insight. The most important lesson from these events is not that blackouts can happen. It is how they happen. Gradually at first. Then suddenly. Controlled systems become unstable. Stable systems become disconnected. Disconnected systems fail. And once failure reaches a certain scale, control is lost. The next phase. Understanding past blackouts provides context. But the next phase is different. Because it is not about how systems fail. It is about what happens after they fail. When power is not restored. When systems remain offline. When time extends beyond what infrastructure can sustain. That is when the true impact begins. Not as an event, but as a process. End of Part 7. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 8 to continue into the first 24 hours of a global blackout and how society begins to unravel in real time. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 8 to continue into the first 24 hours of a global blackout and how society begins to unravel in real time, /. Here is Part 8 of your cinematic documentary series. How a global blackout could collapse modern civilization within days. Part 8, the first 24 hours without power. Hour 0, the moment everything stops. At first, there is no clear distinction between a normal interruption and something far larger. Lights flicker. Screens freeze. Machines shut down mid-process. In cities, people assume it is local. A fault in the neighborhood. A temporary grid issue. Power outages are not uncommon in many regions of the world. But this time the silence spreads. Not gradually in a visible way, but through absence. Streetlights fail in sequence. Traffic signals go dark across districts. Communication networks begin to weaken. And within minutes, the pattern becomes undeniable. This is not a localized failure. It is systemic. Hour 1-3, confusion spreads faster than information. In the early hours, the most important resource is not electricity. It is information. But information depends on the very systems that have just failed. Mobile networks begin to degrade as backup power systems activate. Data centers shift to emergency protocols. But load balancing systems struggle without external grid support. Internet connectivity becomes unstable. Some regions maintain partial access. Others lose it completely. The result is fragmentation. People receive incomplete signals of reality. Some believe the outage is regional. Others suspect cyberattack. Others assume technical malfunction. No single narrative dominates. Uncertainty fills the gap. And uncertainty spreads faster than facts. Hour 3-6, the collapse of coordination. Modern society depends on invisible coordination systems. Transportation schedules. Banking systems. Supply chain logistics. Hospital operations. When electricity disappears, these systems do not immediately collapse. Instead, they degrade. Airports halt departures. Not because planes cannot fly, but because coordination systems fail. Rail networks slow down. Signals and control systems lose synchronization. Traffic in cities becomes increasingly chaotic as signals fail completely. Emergency services shift to manual coordination. But communication delays begin to emerge. Not because people are absent, but because systems connecting them are unstable. At this stage, society is not collapsing. It is fragmenting. Hour 6-9, infrastructure begins to fail quietly. The most dangerous failures are not visible. They occur in systems designed for continuity. Water treatment plants rely on electric pumps. Without power, pressure begins to drop. At first, no one notices. Then water flow weakens in higher elevations. Hospitals switch to backup generators. But fuel supply is finite. Refrigeration systems begin to fail in commercial storage facilities. Food preservation becomes a time-sensitive issue. Cold chain logistics, essential for medicine and food, begins to break. Not dramatically, but steadily. silently. And once these systems begin to degrade, recovery becomes more complex. Hour 9:12, the first signs of social strain. As daylight changes, behavior begins to shift. In dense urban environments, daily routines are disrupted. People leave workplaces early. Public transportation becomes unreliable. Roads become congested as traffic control systems fail. At intersections without signals, movement becomes negotiated rather than regulated. Small delays accumulate into large-scale congestion. In some areas, order is maintained through cooperation. In others, confusion leads to conflict over resources. Not widespread collapse, but localized instability. The key shift is psychological. People begin to realize that restoration is not immediate. And that realization changes behavior. Hour 12:16, night without infrastructure. As darkness returns, cities lose their defining structure. Electric light has always been more than convenience. It is orientation. Without it, urban spaces become unfamiliar. Street navigation becomes difficult. Security systems are inactive or limited. Emergency lighting is insufficient for scale. Human perception narrows. Movement slows. In some areas, people remain indoors. In others, movement increases due to uncertainty or necessity. The absence of visibility increases tension. Not because of direct threat, but because of unpredictability. Hour 16:20, emergency systems under strain. Backup systems begin to reach limits. Fuel reserves for generators decline. Hospitals prioritize critical care. Non-essential services are suspended. Emergency response teams operate with limited coordination. Communication is inconsistent. Some radio systems remain functional. Others fail due to infrastructure dependencies. Decision-making slows. Not because of lack of expertise, but because of incomplete information. In complex systems, partial data is often more dangerous than no data, because it creates false confidence. Hour 2022, the fragility of supply chains. Modern cities operate on just-in-time logistics. Food is not stored in large reserves. It is continuously delivered. Without power, distribution networks slow. Refrigerated storage begins to fail in multiple nodes. Fuel distribution becomes limited due to pump failures. Retail systems stop functioning. Supermarkets where functional experience increased demand. Not due to panic, but due to uncertainty about duration. The key transition begins here. From consumption based on routine to consumption based on fear of scarcity. Hour 22:24, the system no longer feels temporary. As the first full day approaches its end, perception changes fundamentally. What began as an outage is now understood as something larger. Not fully defined, but clearly not short-term. This shift is critical, because modern systems are designed for short disruptions. Hours, sometimes days, but not indefinite failure. Planning assumes restoration. When that assumption weakens, behavior changes at scale. Some begin conserving resources. Others begin securing supplies. Authorities attempt stabilization messaging. But communication remains inconsistent. And inconsistency reduces trust. The first 24 hours, a structural summary. Nothing has fully collapsed yet. Buildings still stand. Most systems still exist in partial form. But the structure of coordination has weakened. Electricity is not just power. It is synchronization. And without synchronization, complex systems drift apart. Transportation becomes disorganized. Communication becomes fragmented. Healthcare becomes constrained. Supply chains slow. Information becomes unreliable. Each system still functions individually, but the connections between them weaken. And in complex civilization, connections are everything. The critical threshold. The most important realization from the first 24 hours is not visible damage. It is dependency exposure. Every major system depends on another. And those dependencies are not designed for simultaneous failure. Under normal conditions, redundancy absorbs stress. But under total loss of power, redundancy itself becomes limited. Because redundancy also depends on electricity. This creates a cascading vulnerability that is not immediately obvious until it is tested. The shift from event to condition. By the end of the first day, the blackout is no longer treated as an event. It becomes a condition. Something ongoing. Something uncertain. And uncertainty is the most destabilizing factor of all. Because systems can adapt to failure, but they struggle to adapt to unknown duration. And at this stage, duration is no longer predictable. What comes next? The first 24 hours reveal structure under stress. But they do not reveal the full consequences, because systems still retain partial functionality. The next phase is different. It is not about disruption. It is about degradation. When temporary systems fail, when reserves deplete, when coordination becomes impossible at scale, that is when collapse shifts from possibility to process. End of Part 8. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 9 to continue into Day 2-3 and the beginning of systemic breakdown across infrastructure, economy, and public order. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 9 to continue into Day 2-3 and the beginning of systemic breakdown across infrastructure, economy, and public order. Here is Part 9 of your cinematic documentary series. How a global blackout could collapse modern civilization within days. Part 9 when systems begin to break. Day 2 the illusion of stability starts to fade. By the second day the blackout is no longer interpreted as a temporary disruption. The assumption of quick restoration begins to weaken. Not because of official confirmation, but because of absence. No clear timeline. No consistent communication. No visible recovery of core systems. In modern infrastructure, uncertainty is more destabilizing than failure itself. Because systems are built on expectations of continuity. And when continuity is no longer guaranteed, behavior begins to shift at scale. Infrastructure at the edge of design limits. Electric grids are designed with redundancy. Backup routes. Alternate substations. Load balancing systems. But redundancy depends on functioning control layers. On communication. On monitoring systems. By Day 2 those layers are degraded. Not entirely gone, but unreliable. As a result, operators are forced into partial manual control. But manual control does not scale to national or global systems. It was never intended to. So decisions slow. And small delays accumulate into systemic stress. Water systems begin to fail structurally. One of the earliest critical failures emerges in water infrastructure. Pumping stations rely on continuous electricity. Without it, pressure regulation becomes unstable. Reservoir distribution becomes uneven. Higher elevation zones experience reduced flow first. Then wider regions begin to feel impact. At first it is perceived as reduced pressure. Then intermittent supply. Then complete interruption in some districts. Water is not just a resource. It is a foundation system. Its degradation affects hygiene, healthcare, and survival simultaneously. Hospitals transition from emergency to crisis mode. Healthcare systems are among the most resilient structures in modern society. But they are also among the most dependent on electricity. By Day 2, backup generators are still functioning in many facilities. But fuel logistics begin to strain. Refueling requires transportation. Transportation depends on coordination. Coordination depends on communication systems that are degraded. This creates a bottleneck. Hospitals begin prioritizing only the most critical cases. Non-essential procedures are suspended entirely. Medical systems shift from treatment to triage. Not by choice, but by limitation. Financial systems freeze without synchronization. Modern financial systems rely on constant digital synchronization. Transactions. Clearance systems. Interbank communications. When power instability persists, financial networks begin to fragment. Some systems operate in isolation. Others enter protective shutdown modes. ATMs may still function in limited regions. But without network verification, transactions fail or delay. The result is not immediate economic collapse. It is paralysis. A system unable to confirm value exchange cannot function at scale. Supply chains enter structural disruption. Global supply chains are built on precision timing. Inventory flows are calculated in hours, not days. Warehouses operate with minimal long-term storage. By day 2, transportation delays become systemic. Fuel distribution is inconsistent. Cold storage systems are failing in multiple regions. Goods in transit become stranded at intermediate points. Ports slow operations due to lack of coordination systems. Not all movement stops, but movement loses predictability. And predictability is the foundation of logistics. Day 2 night, urban environments lose rhythm. By the second night, cities begin to lose their operational rhythm. Traffic systems remain largely non-functional. Lighting is limited or absent in many districts. Emergency services are stretched thin. Human movement becomes cautious and irregular. Some areas remain calm and organized. Others experience localized instability due to uncertainty. The key change is psychological. People begin to realize that restoration is not imminent. This realization spreads slowly, but its impact is immediate. Because expectations define behavior, communication breakdown deepens fragmentation. Radio systems and limited satellite communication still function in some regions, but coordination across regions becomes inconsistent. Information arrives delayed or incomplete. Conflicting reports emerge. Some regions report partial restoration. Others report worsening conditions. This inconsistency reduces trust in centralized communication. Local interpretation begins to replace centralized information. And when interpretation replaces coordination, systems begin to diverge. Economic activity enters dormant state. By day 2, economic activity is no longer functioning in a normal sense. Not because value disappears, but because exchange mechanisms are degraded. Markets require trust, timing, and infrastructure. All three are under strain. Businesses close not necessarily due to damage, but due to uncertainty of operation. Production halts in many sectors. Not all at once, but progressively. And this progression matters, because staggered failure is harder to reverse. Public behavior shifts from adaptation to conservation. In the early phase, behavior is adaptive. People adjust routines, conserve resources, seek information. By day 2, adaptation shifts toward conservation. Energy use is minimized where possible. Movement decreases in many areas. People begin prioritizing immediate needs over routine activities. This is not panic. It is recalibration. A recognition that systems may not return quickly. The first signs of structural stress in governance. Governance systems rely on layered communication. Local, regional, national coordination. By day 2, these layers begin to experience delays. Meetings become less frequent or less synchronized. Decision cycles slow. Not due to lack of authority, but due to incomplete situational awareness. In complex systems, incomplete information leads to conservative decision-making. And conservative decision-making slows response further. Day 3 approaches the transition point. As day 3 approaches, the situation crosses a subtle but critical threshold. Systems are still functioning, but their capacity is reduced, and their coordination is weakened. This combination creates a fragile equilibrium. Because systems are not fully broken, but they are no longer stable. This is the phase where cascading failures become more likely. Not because of a single trigger, but because of accumulated strain. The hidden mechanism of collapse. What becomes increasingly clear is that collapse in complex systems rarely occurs from one catastrophic failure. It occurs from interaction between multiple weakened components. Water systems strain. Transport slows. Communication fragments. Healthcare prioritizes. Economy freezes. Each system still exists, but interdependence weakens overall stability. And interdependence is what holds modern civilization together. A system holding its breath. By the end of day 2, civilization has not collapsed, but it is no longer operating normally. It is suspended, functioning in partial states. maintaining structure without full coordination. Like a system holding its breath. Waiting. Not for recovery, but for direction. The transition to systemic breakdown. The importance of this phase is not what fails, but what remains. Because what remains determines what can still be recovered. And as day 3 begins, that question becomes critical. Because the margin between disruption and collapse is narrowing. And the system is approaching a point where recovery may no longer follow normal pathways. What comes next? Day 3 marks the beginning of systemic breakdown. Not total collapse, but accelerating degradation. Where isolated failures become connected. And connected failures become self-reinforcing. That is the next stage. And it changes the nature of the blackout entirely. End of Part 9. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 10 to continue into full economic breakdown and global coordination failure. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 10 to continue into full economic breakdown and global coordination failure. Here is Part 10 of your cinematic documentary series. How a global blackout could collapse modern civilization within days. Part 10 When the global economy stops moving. Day 3 The point where fragility becomes visible. By the third day, the blackout is no longer interpreted as a temporary infrastructure failure. It is now understood, at least partially, as a systemic condition. Electricity is still absent in large regions. But more importantly, coordination between systems has weakened to the point where recovery is no longer linear. What once failed in isolation now begins to fail in sequence. And the most visible reflection of this shift appears in the global economy. Not as collapse, but as immobilization. The economy as a real-time system. Modern economies do not operate like static structures. They function as continuous real-time systems. Transactions clear instantly. Markets adjust within seconds. Supply chains respond dynamically to demand. Production is synchronized across continents. But this synchronization depends on one core assumption: constant communication between systems. Without electricity, that assumption no longer holds. And when communication breaks, the economy does not crash immediately. It freezes. Financial networks enter protective shutdown. By day 3, financial institutions across multiple regions begin to isolate themselves. Not as a coordinated global decision, but as localized protective responses. Transaction systems fail, verification processes. Interbank clearing mechanisms slow or halt. Some systems shift into offline reconciliation modes. Others suspend operations entirely to prevent corruption of financial data. This creates a paradox. Money still exists, but its movement becomes uncertain. And in modern economies, movement is more important than existence. The collapse of market synchronization. Global markets rely on synchronized information. Prices reflect real-time conditions. Supply reflects demand signals. But without stable communication networks, price discovery mechanisms begin to fail. Different regions begin to show inconsistent valuations. Some markets operate with delayed data. Others operate in isolation. This fragmentation leads to a breakdown in global pricing coherence. Not inflation, not deflation, but disconnection. Trade routes without coordination. International trade depends on tightly coordinated logistics systems. Ports, air routes, shipping lanes, customs systems. By day 3, many of these systems continue to function physically. Ships are still in motion. Airplanes are still grounded or rerouted. Trucks still operate where possible. But coordination between nodes is weakening. Containers arrive without confirmation systems. Schedules lose reliability. Cargo tracking becomes inconsistent. The physical world continues moving. But the informational layer that organizes it begins to dissolve. Energy markets and the paradox of abundance. Energy systems are among the most critical components of global infrastructure. Oil, gas, electricity, coal, renewables. By day 3, extraction and refinement systems begin to slow in multiple regions. Not due to resource shortage, But due to operational disruption, refineries require stable control systems. Pipelines require monitoring. Distribution networks require coordination. Without electricity, these systems operate at reduced capacity or shut down entirely. The paradox emerges. Energy exists in abundance but becomes inaccessible. Manufacturing chains enter stasis. Global manufacturing is built on sequential dependency. Raw materials, processing, assembly, distribution. Each stage relies on precise timing and communication. By day 3, factories in multiple regions begin shutting down production lines. Not due to physical damage, but due to uncertainty in upstream and downstream coordination. Components cannot be sourced reliably. Finished goods cannot be distributed predictably. Just-in-time manufacturing collapses into just-in-case uncertainty. And uncertainty halts production. Currency systems lose temporal integrity. One of the least visible but most critical impacts emerges in financial timing systems. Modern currency exchange depends on synchronized timestamps. Transaction validation relies on precise sequencing. Without stable power and communication infrastructure, timing discrepancies emerge. Even small desynchronizations create validation failures. Systems reject transactions not because of lack of funds, but because of inability to confirm timing integrity. This effectively slows global liquidity without formally shutting it down. Digital infrastructure fragmentation. Data centers continue operating where backup systems remain functional. But interconnection between them weakens. Cloud services begin regional isolation. Some platforms remain accessible locally. Others become partially unavailable. Data replication slows or halts. Consistency between systems breaks down. This leads to a subtle but critical failure. Different users in different regions experience different versions of reality. Not misinformation, but system divergence. Supply chain decoupling begins. By day 3, supply chains begin to decouple. This means they no longer function as integrated global systems. Instead, they fragment into regional clusters. Each cluster attempts to stabilize independently. But without external input, efficiency declines rapidly. Shortages begin to appear in unexpected areas. Not because goods are unavailable globally, but because distribution pathways are disrupted. This creates uneven scarcity, a defining feature of systemic breakdown. Transportation networks lose predictive control. Air traffic control systems rely on continuous data exchange. Without it, flights are delayed, rerouted, or grounded. Rail systems face similar constraints. Scheduling systems become unreliable. Even road transport is affected indirectly through fuel distribution instability and traffic coordination loss. The key shift is not movement failure. It is prediction failure. Systems no longer know what will happen next. And without prediction, optimization becomes impossible. The emergence of regional autonomy. As global coordination weakens, regions begin to operate more independently. Not politically, but functionally. Each region adapts to its own constraints. Energy availability, communication stability, resource access. This creates uneven recovery trajectories. Some regions stabilize faster. Others degrade further. Global uniformity dissolves into fragmented resilience. Economic psychology shifts from fear to preservation. By this stage, behavior changes again. The initial confusion of day 1, the adaptation of day 2, now transitions into preservation logic. Institutions and individuals prioritize resource conservation over activity. Not because systems have fully failed, but because trust in systemic recovery has weakened. This shift is subtle but powerful. Because economies depend on confidence as much as infrastructure. The hidden failure, coordination not resources. A critical misconception emerges during large-scale blackouts. The assumption that scarcity is the primary issue. In reality, the primary failure is coordination. Resources still exist. Energy still exists. Goods still exist. But the ability to move, synchronize, and allocate them efficiently breaks down. This is why recovery is not simply a matter of restoration. It requires reintegration. And reintegration is far more complex. Day 3 end a global system without unity. By the end of day 3, the global economy is no longer unified. It still functions in fragments, but not as a single system. Trade continues in limited forms. Financial systems operate in isolated clusters. Production exists in partial states. But the connective tissue between these systems has weakened significantly. And without that connective tissue, scale becomes irrelevant. The transition point. This stage marks a critical transition. From disruption of systems to fragmentation of systems. And once fragmentation begins at global scale, reconstruction becomes exponentially more complex. Because it is no longer about restoring function. It is about reconnecting broken layers of interdependence. What comes next? Economic breakdown is only one layer. But it accelerates everything else. Because economies support infrastructure. Infrastructure supports society. Society supports governance. When economic coordination fails, every other system feels the impact. The next phase explores that convergence, where infrastructure, governance, and society begin to interact under sustained blackout conditions. And the pressure begins to compound. End of Part 10. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 11 to continue into government response, military coordination, and attempts to stabilize collapsing systems. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 11 to continue into government response, military coordination, and attempts to stabilize collapsing systems. Here is Part 11 of your cinematic documentary series. How a global blackout could collapse modern civilization within days. Part 11 when power shifts to emergency systems. Day 4 the system recognizes itself as a crisis. By the 4th day, the nature of the blackout is no longer debated in technical terms alone. It is now treated as a governance-level emergency. Across multiple nations, emergency protocols that were designed for localized disasters are activated in parallel. But there is a fundamental limitation. These protocols were never designed for synchronized, global-scale failure. Each system assumes the existence of functioning external systems. And that assumption is now no longer valid. The first layer of response, emergency command structures. Governments transition into emergency command modes. Centralized decision-making increases. Non-essential administrative functions are reduced or suspended. Emergency operations centers become the primary coordination hubs. But these centers rely on layered communication networks. And those networks are degraded. As a result, command structures function but with reduced clarity. Decisions are made with incomplete information. And incomplete information leads to conservative and delayed responses. Military systems enter stabilization mode. In many regions, military organizations become critical support structures. Not as offensive forces, but as logistical and stabilization units. Their roles expand into transport coordination, infrastructure protection, emergency supply distribution, communication relay support. Military systems retain partial operational integrity due to independent power reserves and hardened infrastructure. However, they face the same constraint as civilian systems. Coordination depends on communication networks that are partially degraded. This limits their effectiveness at scale. The communication bottleneck. One of the most severe challenges emerges immediately. Information flow. Satellite systems provide partial communication capability. Radio networks operate intermittently. Physical dispatch of information becomes necessary in some cases. This creates a bottleneck where decision-making speed is determined by the slowest transmission method available. In complex systems, speed is not just efficiency. It is stability. And when speed decreases, stability begins to erode. Critical infrastructure protection begins. Priority is given to systems classified as essential. Water treatment facilities, hospitals, fuel storage and distribution centers, power grid recovery units, emergency communication nodes. Military and civil engineering units are deployed to protect and maintain these systems. But protection does not equal functionality. Many systems remain offline due to upstream dependencies. Without electricity and coordination networks, protection only preserves structure, not operation. The fuel crisis intensifies. One of the most immediate logistical challenges becomes fuel distribution. Backup generators depend on diesel, gasoline, or other stored energy sources. However, transportation systems are disrupted. Refining operations are limited. Distribution tracking is inconsistent. Fuel exists in reserves, but access becomes uneven. Some regions maintain operational capacity. Others face rapid depletion. This creates asymmetry in resilience across different areas. Information control becomes a strategic priority. As uncertainty increases, governments attempt to stabilize public perception. Not through misinformation, but through controlled communication. However, communication channels are fragmented. Messages do not reach all populations equally. Inconsistent messaging creates interpretive gaps. And in complex crises, interpretation fills the gap left by missing data. This leads to variation in understanding across regions. Some populations perceive partial recovery. Others perceive worsening conditions. Civil order under strain. Military and emergency forces begin assisting in maintaining civil order. Not due to widespread collapse, but due to localized instability caused by resource uncertainty, communication breakdown, transportation disruption. In many areas, order remains intact. In others, pressure points emerge. The key factor is not conflict itself, but the speed of coordination response. Where response is fast, stability is maintained. Where response is delayed, instability increases. Medical system stabilization efforts. Hospitals and emergency medical centers receive priority support. Mobile medical units are deployed in some regions. Field hospitals are established near critical zones. However, medical supply chains are under strain. Medication distribution depends on logistics systems that are partially disrupted. Even where facilities remain operational, resource replenishment becomes inconsistent. This forces medical systems into strict prioritization protocols. Treatment shifts from comprehensive care to survival-focused intervention. Infrastructure repair teams deploy. Engineering units and technical response teams begin assessing damaged infrastructure. However, assessment itself is difficult. Because diagnostic systems rely on sensors, telemetry, and communication networks. Many of these systems are offline or degraded. As a result, repair becomes manual and localized. This slows restoration efforts significantly. And slows recovery, increases systemic stress. The coordination paradox. At this stage, a paradox becomes clear. The more urgent the situation becomes, the harder it is to coordinate response. Because urgency requires speed. But speed requires communication. And communication infrastructure is compromised. This creates a feedback loop where response capacity is limited precisely when it is most needed. Regional stabilization versus global fragmentation. Some regions achieve partial stabilization. Through redundancy. Through stronger infrastructure. Through effective local coordination. But this stabilization is not uniform. Other regions continue to experience degradation. The result is fragmentation of global response capability. There is no unified recovery trajectory. Only parallel and uneven stabilization efforts. Resource allocation becomes strategic, not economic. Traditional economic allocation mechanisms begin to fail. In their place, strategic allocation systems emerge. Based on priority, human survival, infrastructure stability, communication restoration, logistics continuity. This shift represents a fundamental transition from market-based distribution to command-based distribution. But command systems are limited in scale. And scale is the defining challenge of global systems. The psychological shift in governance. Decision-making bodies begin operating under sustained crisis pressure. This leads to increased conservatism in planning. Focus on short-term stabilization. Reduction in long-term policy execution. Governance shifts from expansion and development to preservation and containment. Not as a choice, but as a necessity of conditions. Military limitations in systemic collapse. Despite their organizational strength, military systems face structural constraints. Dependence on civilian infrastructure. Limited ability to replace grid-level systems. Communication dependency on damaged networks. They can stabilize environments, but they cannot restore systemic interdependence alone. This distinction is critical, because stabilization is not recovery. It is containment. Day 4 end a controlled but fragmented system. By the end of Day 4, collapse has not fully occurred. But neither has recovery begun. Instead, the system exists in a controlled fragmentation state. Multiple centers of authority. Multiple operational conditions. Multiple recovery trajectories. The global system has not failed uniformly. It is split into operational zones, each functioning under different constraints. The structural reality. The key realization of this phase is not that systems are failing. It is that systems are no longer unified. And without unity, global coordination becomes a collection of isolated responses, not a single recovery process. What comes next? Military and government stabilization efforts can slow collapse, but they cannot fully reverse systemic fragmentation on their own. Because the root problem is not damage. It is interdependence breakdown. The next phase explores what happens when stabilization reaches its limits. And society must adapt to long-term systemic disconnection, where recovery is no longer immediate, but uncertain. End of Part 11. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 12 to continue into human behavior, societal adaptation and psychological breakdown under prolonged blackout conditions. Backhand index pointing right reply Part 12 to continue into human behavior, societal adaptation and psychological breakdown under prolonged blackout conditions. Here is Part 12 of your cinematic documentary series. How a global blackout could collapse modern civilization within days. Part 12, the human system under pressure. Day 5, when the system becomes personal. By the 5th day, the blackout is no longer experienced as an infrastructure event. It is experienced as a lived condition. Electricity is absent not in abstract terms, but in daily reality. The absence is no longer measured in systems. It is measured in routines that no longer function. Timekeeping becomes less precise. Movement becomes more deliberate. Communication becomes fragmented. And gradually, human behavior begins to reorganize itself around limitation rather than expectation. The first psychological shift, from expectation to uncertainty. In the early phase of the blackout, most people operate under a shared assumption that systems will return. This assumption guides behavior. It limits panic. It preserves order. But by day 5, that assumption weakens. Not because of official statements, but because of experience. Each passing day without restoration reduces confidence in short-term recovery. And when confidence declines, behavior changes before systems do. Routine collapse and the loss of temporal structure. Modern life depends on structured time. Work schedules, school systems, transportation timing, digital reminders. Without electrical systems, this structure begins to dissolve. People still track time, but less precisely. Daily routines become adaptive rather than scheduled. Sleep cycles begin to shift based on environmental conditions rather than social norms. This loss of temporal structure affects cognition, because human decision-making is deeply tied to routine stability. Urban behavior from flow to stagnation. Cities begin to show a different rhythm. Not chaos, but uneven stillness. Some areas remain active due to necessity. Others become quiet as movement decreases. Traffic is no longer organized by signals. It is negotiated through awareness and caution. Public spaces lose density in some regions and increase in others depending on resource availability. This uneven distribution creates a patchwork urban pattern. Not collapse, but fragmentation of movement. The psychology of resource awareness. One of the most significant behavioral changes is increased attention to resources. Not panic-driven hoarding at a global scale, but localized conservation behavior. People become more aware of food availability, water access, fuel distribution, battery or power reserves where available. This awareness alters decision-making. Actions become shorter-term, less exploratory, more conservative, because uncertainty about replenishment shapes every choice. The breakdown of information trust. As communication systems remain unstable, information reliability declines. People receive partial updates, delayed reports, conflicting narratives. This leads to a shift in how information is processed. Rather than relying on centralized systems, individuals and communities begin relying on direct observation and local knowledge. This transition is critical because once shared information systems weaken, collective coordination becomes more difficult. Community formation under constraint. In many regions, new forms of local organization begin to emerge. Not formal institutions, but practical coordination groups. Neighbors coordinate water access. Local networks share transportation resources. Small groups organize safety patrols or supply distribution. These structures are not ideological. They are functional. They emerge because centralized systems are no longer fully reliable. The psychological strain of continuity without resolution. One of the most overlooked stress factors is duration.